You are creating a true crime documentary about the Keddie Cabin Murders, one of the most brutal unsolved cases in American history. 4 people were savagely murdered in a remote mountain cabin in 1981, and despite overwhelming evidence and clear suspects, no one has ever been charged. Character. This is an unsolved case with an unknown perpetrator. Use imagery of the isolated Keddie Resort location, Cabin 28 crime scene respectfully, evidence including weapons found at the scene, investigators, 1980s newspaper coverage, and atmospheric shots of the remote Sierra Nevada mountains. Do not attempt to depict any suspected perpetrators. Visual, documentary-style footage of the remote Keddie Resort in Plumas County, California. Focus on Cabin 28, the isolation of the location, evidence photos, and the investigative failures that allowed killers to escape justice. Narration, clear, journalistic, but engaging. Conversational while maintaining credibility. Keep evergreen. This is a story about Sue Sharp and her family, and how their brutal murders in a remote mountain cabin exposed one of the worst investigative failures in American crime history. April 12, 1981. Sheila Sharp, 14 years old, returns to Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. She had spent the night at a neighbor's cabin. When she opens the front door, she finds a scene of unimaginable horror. Her mother Sue, her brother John, and his friend Dana Wingate are dead. They had been bound with medical tape and electrical cord, then beaten and stabbed repeatedly. The violence was so extreme that the weapons, a hammer and 2 knives, were bent from the force. Blood covered the walls, ceiling, and floors. But here's what nobody knew at the time. This wasn't just a random act of violence. The evidence would point directly to suspects with connections to local law enforcement, and the case would be deliberately mishandled from the very beginning. Sue Sharp was 36 years old, a mother of 5 who had recently left an abusive marriage. She moved her family from Connecticut to Keddie, a struggling resort town in rural California, hoping for a fresh start. The Keddie Resort consisted of small cabins that had been converted into low-income housing. It was isolated, poor, and troubled. Sue worked as a waitress and tried to build a new life for her children. Her oldest daughter Sheila was 14, John was 15, Tina was 12, Greg was 10, Rick was 5. The night of April 11th, Sheila stayed overnight at Cabin 27 with a friend. Greg and Rick slept in their bedroom at the back of Cabin 28. They would sleep through the entire attack, separated only by a thin wall. That same night, John had a friend over. Dana Wingate, 17 years old, lived nearby. The boys were in the living room with Sue, likely watching television or talking. Sometime after 10 p.m., someone entered the cabin. What happened next was a sustained, brutal attack that lasted hours. Sue, John, and Dana were bound and tortured. The killers used a hammer and 2 steak knives. The medical examiner would later determine the victims had been beaten, stabbed, and strangled. Sue had been stabbed in the throat. John's skull was fractured. Dana had been strangled with electrical cord. The violence was personal, rage-filled, and excessive. But here's what nobody's talking about. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. Her bed was empty. There was no sign of her at the crime scene. When Sheila discovered the bodies the next morning, she ran to Cabin 27 and called for help. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene. What they did next, and what they failed to do, would doom the investigation. Crime scene photos show investigators walking through blood without protective gear, contaminating evidence. The hammer and knives were found at the scene, but were handled improperly. A bloody fingerprint was found on a handrail. Medical tape and electrical cord showed the victims had been restrained. But the sheriff's department made critical errors. They failed to properly secure the scene. They allowed people to walk through before evidence was collected. They ignored witness statements. They dismissed suspects with obvious motives and opportunity. Neighbors reported hearing sounds of a fight and screaming that night. Some heard voices. One witness saw a green van parked near Cabin 28. Another saw strangers in the area. But the sheriff's department didn't follow up on these leads. Why? Because the primary suspects were connected to people in power. Within days of the murders, attention focused on 2 men, Martin Smart and John Bobby Day. Smart lived in Cabin 26, right next door to Sue Sharp. He was married to Marilyn Smart, who was friends with Sue. But Martin was volatile, violent, and unstable. Witnesses reported he had an obsession with Sue and resented her rejection. John Bubede was Smart's friend, a drifter with a violent criminal history. Both men had the motive, means, and opportunity. But here's what investigators ignored. Marilyn Smart told police her husband had come home the night of the murders with blood on him. She said she found bloody medical tape in their trash. A counselor came forward and said Martin Smart had confessed to the murders during a therapy session, stating he had done something terrible and that Sue and Tina were involved. John Bobede had told multiple people he had killed 2 people in California before leaving the state. Both men left Keddie shortly after the murders and moved to different states. The sheriff's department knew all of this. They did nothing. For 3 years, the case went cold. Tina Sharp's disappearance remained a mystery. Sue's surviving children were left without answers. Then, in April 1984, a bottle hunter found a human skull in Camp 18, 29 miles from Keddie. It was Tina Sharp. Her remains were scattered, damaged by animals and weather. The cause of death couldn't be determined, but it was clear she had been killed and dumped far from the cabin. This confirmed what investigators had suspected. The killers had taken Tina from the cabin that night. Whether she witnessed the murders or was simply in the wrong place remains unknown, but her abduction and murder proved this was planned, not a spontaneous act of violence. The case remained officially unsolved for decades. Plumas County Sheriff's Office did little to pursue the investigation. Martin Smart died in 2000 in a trailer fire. John Bobede died in 1988. Both men had lived free for years despite overwhelming evidence of their involvement. But then something changed. In 2008, the case was reopened by new investigators who were horrified by what they found. Evidence had been lost, destroyed, or ignored. A hammer matching the murder weapon had been found in a pond near Cabin 28, but was never tested. Medical tape found at the Smart cabin was never compared to tape used to bind the victims. Bloody fingerprints were never properly analyzed. Witness statements were dismissed without follow-up. In 2016, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office officially named Martin Smart and John Bobede as the primary suspects. They also named Smart's wife, Marilyn, and another man, convicted child molester Donald Irvin Cheney, as possible accomplices. But here's how they finally pieced it together. A letter written by Marilyn Smart was discovered in 2016 in evidence storage. In it, she implicated her husband and Bobede in the murders. She described finding bloody evidence and expressed fear for her own safety. Investigators also found a hammer in a shallow pond near the cabins in 2018 that matched the description of the murder weapon. But by then, all primary suspects were dead. No charges could be filed. No trial would ever occur. The Keddie Cabin Murders destroyed the surviving Sharp children's lives. Sheila Sharp, who found her mother and brother's bodies, spent decades haunted by what she saw. Greg and Rick Sharp, who slept through the attack in the next room, carried guilt for not waking up. Sue's other children struggled with trauma and loss. The case revealed catastrophic failures in the justice system. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office had protected suspects, ignored evidence, and allowed killers to escape. Why? Some believe Martin Smart had connections to local law enforcement through his wife's family. Others suggest incompetence and small-town politics. Whatever the reason, 4 people were murdered, and the case was deliberately mishandled. The Keddie Resort was demolished in the early 2000s. Cabin 28 no longer exists, but the case remains open. In recent years, advances in DNA technology have allowed investigators to retest evidence. Fingerprints found at the scene have been re-examined. Witness statements have been revisited. The surviving Sharp children have advocated for justice, speaking publicly about the case and demanding accountability. But with all primary suspects dead, the chance of criminal prosecution has passed. The case will likely remain officially unsolved forever. The impact of the Keddie Cabin murders extends beyond one family. It exposed how easily justice can be corrupted when investigators protect their own. It showed how small-town politics can override the law. It demonstrated how victims can be forgotten when they don't have power or money or connections. Sue Sharp was a single mother trying to escape abuse and build a better life. Her children deserved safety. Instead, they got violence, death, and decades of official indifference. What does this say about justice when the victims are poor, isolated, and powerless? And how many other cases have been buried because the wrong people were involved?